She had already decided the answer before she ever mailed the letter. No man wants half a woman. That was the sentence she carried folded up small behind her ribs, the one she'd learned to say to herself before anyone else could say it for her. She had watched the way people's eyes dropped to the empty place where her leg used to be, and then climbed back up to her face wearing a look she'd come to hate more than pity, that soft, apologetic mercy, like she was already something to be grieved. So when she finally wrote the notice, she wrote it certain of the silence that would follow. She folded in one honest line near the bottom, a small confession she was sure would end it all before it began. And then a cowboy wrote back. He didn't write back to be kind. He wrote back because of the one line she almost hadn't included. This is the story of what happened after, told by the man who answered, who swears to this day he wasn't looking for anyone at all. I keep a ledger. Have since I was 14, and my father put the outfit's tally book in my hands and told me a thing isn't real until it's written down. Cattle, feed, weather, wages, the day the well went dry and the day it came back. I write it all in a small crabbed hand so the pages last longer, and when I'm nervous I count things that don't need counting. Fence posts, the buttons on a man's coat, the seconds between a train whistle and the sound of the wheels. I counted 41 seconds that morning at the Camino Verde depot, and I have never in my life wanted to run so badly from a thing I had asked for myself. Let me back up, because a ledger only makes sense in order. I run a middling cattle operation an hour north of Camino Verde, in the high dry country where the grass is thin and honest and the mountains go blue at the edges by 4 in the afternoon. My name is Sela's Care. I was 36 that spring, which in that country made me neither young nor finished, just weathered enough that people had stopped asking when I'd take a wife and started assuming I never would. Truth is I'd stopped asking myself. A man gets used to the shape of his own quiet. The dog, the horses, the fire, the ledger. It isn't a sad life. I want to be clear about that, because what came after only matters if you understand I wasn't a lonely man reaching for the first hand that reached back. I wasn't reaching for anything. It was my sister Ruth who put the notion in the air. Ruth lived in town with her husband and 3 children and a 4th on the way, and she had appointed herself the sole authority on the deficiencies of my life. She'd come out to the ranch on a Sunday, waddling and fierce, and set a folded newspaper on my table like she was laying down a winning hand. There's women, she said, who advertise, decent women, widows mostly, girls who lost their prospects in the war years or the fevers. They put a notice in the matrimonial columns back east and men out here write to them, and sometimes it takes and sometimes it don't. She smoothed the paper flat. I'm not saying you're desperate, Silas. I'm saying you're stubborn and desperate look the same from the grave. I told her I'd think about it to make her leave. I did not think about it. I put the paper on the shelf by the door where I put things I intend to burn eventually, and I forgot about it through branding and through the spring rains, and through a stretch of weeks where a mountain lion was taking calves, and I slept out with a rifle more nights than in my own bed. But I'm a man who reads what's in front of him. On a rained-in evening in April, with the water coming off the eaves in ropes and nothing to do but wait for the mud to firm, I took that paper down to start the fire with it, and I read the columns instead. Most of them read the same. Refined lady of good character, cheerful disposition, seeks correspondence with view toward matrimony with a Christian gentleman of steady means. They were written to sound like everything and nothing, the way a person writes when they're trying to be wanted by a stranger. I read a dozen without feeling a thing. And then I read hers. It was shorter than the others and plainer, and it didn't try to sound cheerful, which was the first thing that stopped me. It said the writer was 29 years of age, of sound mind and working hands, that she could keep books, mend, cook plain, and read aloud well, that she did not require a wealthy man but an honest one, and that she was not afraid of hard country or hard work. Then, at the very bottom, set apart like she'd argued with herself about whether to write it at all, came the line. The advertiser is obliged to state that she has but one leg, having lost the other below the knee some years past. She manages, but will not have a man travel under a false picture. If this ends your interest, she understands and wishes you well. I sat with that a long time. The fire I'd meant to start stayed unlit. I want to tell you I was moved by her courage or her honesty, and maybe I was some, but the truer thing is uglier, and I'll set it down because the ledger doesn't lie. My first feeling was recognition, not pity, recognition, because I knew that voice. I knew what it was to write your own worst fact at the bottom of the page and hold your breath, waiting to be dismissed. I'd spent my whole life being the boy whose mother left, the man too plain and too quiet, the rancher too poor to be a real prospect and too proud to say so. I knew the specific labor of putting your flaw where a person could see it, so they couldn't wound you with it later. She hadn't written cheerful disposition. She'd written she manages. I lit a lamp instead of the fire, and I wrote to her that night. I'm not a natural letter writer. I don't confess. But I wrote to her the way I'd want to be written to, which is to say I didn't mention the leg at all, not in the first letter, because it seemed to me that if a man's whole reply was about the one thing she'd been dreading, then he'd made it the thing after all. I wrote about the ranch, the thin grass and the blue mountains and the way the light came sideways in the evenings. I wrote about the dog, whose name was Marshall and who had one torn ear from an argument with a javelina. I wrote that I couldn't offer much, but that what I had was mine free and clear, that I'd not lie to her about the hardness of the country, because it seemed she'd had her fill of people softening the truth. I signed it yours in earnest, S. Care, and I rode into town the next morning and mailed it before I could think better of it, and then I felt like a fool for 3 weeks. Her second letter, her reply to mine, I still have. It's in the ledger box, wrapped in oilcloth. I won't copy it all out here, but she'd caught the thing I'd done, and she'd caught it exactly. You are the first, she wrote, who did not answer my confession by reassuring me of his great tolerance. I have been reassured of a great many people's tolerance. It is a heavy gift to carry. I read that line standing in the mud outside the post office with the mules braying behind me, and something in my chest turned over that hadn't turned in years. We wrote through the summer. Her name was Nora Ashby, of a small failed farm outside a town in Ohio I'd never heard of, the last of a family taken piece by piece, her mother to fever, her father to grief and drink and then to the ground, a brother gone to the war and never returned, a sister married off to Kansas and swallowed by distance. Nora had kept the farm alive by herself longer than a woman was supposed to be able to, which was where the leg came into it. She told me the truth of it in August, when we'd written enough that I think she trusted me to hear it plain. It was a thrashing accident. She'd been feeding the machine because there was no one else to do it and the crop had to come in or they'd not eat that winter, and her skirt caught, the way skirts do, the way every farm woman is warned about and does anyway because the work does not wait. The machine took her before she could pull free. A neighbor got her loose and got her to a doctor 2 towns over, and the doctor did what doctors did in those years, which was take the leg below the knee to keep the rot from taking the rest of her. She was 23. She said she remembered less of the pain than of the shame of being carried, of grown men looking away from her while they lifted her, of the specific weight of understanding, even half-conscious, that her life as she'd imagined it had just ended on a thrashing floor. I have thought a great deal since then, she wrote, about the difference between a life ending and a life changing. Most people, when they look at me, see the first. I have had to become a person who insists on the second. It is tiring, Silas. I will be honest with you as you have been with me. It is very tiring to insist, every single day, that you are still a whole person. Some days I do not manage it. I said in my notice that I manage. That is mostly true. I wanted you to know the days it isn't. I read that one twice, and then I did a thing I hadn't done since I was a boy. I put the letter down and I wept, alone, in my own kitchen, over a woman I had never laid eyes on, because I understood exactly, and it had never occurred to me that anyone else in the world was carrying the same tiredness I was. I wrote back and asked her to come. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make myself sound better than I was. I didn't ask her to come because I'd fallen in love with her. You can't love a person you've never met, whatever the songs say. I asked her because I'd stopped being able to imagine my kitchen without the letters in it, and because a coward would have kept writing forever, safe behind the distance, and I was tired of being that particular coward. I sent the fare. She wrote back that it would take her some weeks to settle the farm sale and make the journey, and that she would send word ahead. Which brings me back to the depot, to the 41 seconds, to the worst and best morning of my life. I'd not slept. I'd counted the ceiling boards in the dark and shaved twice and put on the one good shirt Ruth had made me and stood on the depot platform an hour early like a man waiting for a hanging, his own. Ruth had wanted to come. I'd told her no. Whatever this was, I needed it to be mine, not a thing my sister supervised. The train came in loud and hot, all steam and iron and the smell of coal smoke and cattle from the stock cars behind. And I stood there and I realized with a lurch that I did not know how I would find her. She'd sent no likeness. I knew her only through her handwriting and the confessions in it. And now here were 40 people coming off a train, and any of them could be her and none of them could be. And I counted them off the steps like fence posts because I did not know what else to do with my hands. She was the last. She came to the top of the train steps and she stopped, and I understood why she was last. She had waited until the crowd thinned so no one would be behind her, no one to jostle, no one to watch her come down. She had a crutch under her right arm, wooden, worn smooth and pale at the grip where her hand had held it for years. Her skirt was pinned up on the left so it wouldn't drag or catch, and below it I could see the shape of the thing, not a leg, a peg of turned wood and leather straps, the kind a man makes when he can't afford the fancy jointed ones from back east. She was thin from the journey and gray with travel, and her hair had come loose from its pins, and she stood at the top of those steps looking down at the platform with a face I knew, a face I had worn, the face of a person bracing to be seen and found wanting. Then she looked up and found me. She knew me the way I somehow knew her, without a likeness, from something in the standing, and I watched her whole body prepare for the look she expected to see on my face. I watched her get ready to be a disappointment. I have thought about that moment more than any other in my life, and I still don't have the words for what it was to watch a person, a grown woman of dignity and iron, flinch preemptively at a cruelty I hadn't even given her. She'd been given it so many times she flinched at the shape of it in advance. And God help me, I froze. Not from what you'd think, not from the leg. I froze because in that moment I understood the size of what I'd done, sending for a whole living person on the strength of some letters, a person who had crossed a continent alone, hauling herself in one trunk and a lifetime of being looked at wrong, and who was now standing 8 feet from me waiting to learn whether she'd done it for nothing. I froze because I was suddenly, entirely certain that I was not equal to the weight of her. That I was a plain, quiet rancher who counted fence posts, and here was this enormous, brave, difficult, ruined, magnificent stranger. And what could I possibly be to her but one more disappointment in a long line? 41 seconds. I counted them. She stood at the top of the steps and I stood at the bottom of my own cowardice, and the train hissed, and the seconds went by, and her face began, slowly, to close. I watched hope leave it the way water leaves cracked ground, going down and gone, and I understood that my silence was doing to her exactly what she'd braced for, that my frozen tongue was speaking louder than any cruelty I could have said aloud. She started to turn. She was going to get back on the train. She had already, I think, begun the private ritual of survival, the folding up of the letter behind the ribs. No man wants half a woman, you knew this. You always knew this, foolish to have hoped, and she was going to carry herself back onto that train and ride it somewhere else and start the tiredness over. And it was Marshall who broke it. I'd brought the fool dog. He'd been sitting at my heel the whole time, and something about the woman turning to leave set him off, and he trotted forward across the platform with his torn ear and his ridiculous grin and went straight to her, the way he goes to no one, and put his head against the wood of her false leg and leaned, the whole warm weight of him, the way he leans on me by the fire. She looked down at the dog, and I found my voice, finally, cracked and too loud in the emptying station, and what I said was not hello, and it was not her name, and it was not any of the fine things I'd rehearsed for weeks. What I said was the truest thing in me, which came out of me before I could shape it into something better. That's Marshall. He's got a torn ear. I wrote you about him. He don't lean on strangers. And Nora Ashby stood at the top of the train steps with a strange dog leaning on her wooden leg, and she looked at me, this plain frozen fool who'd made her wait 41 seconds to know she was wanted, and something moved across her face that I can only call the arrival of a small, unwilling, disbelieving hope. Like she'd told it to stay dead, and it wouldn't. No, she said. Her voice was lower than I'd imagined it and steadier, and it shook only at the very end. You wrote that he doesn't. I'll come get your trunk, I said. The steps are steep. I won't carry you. I know you don't want carrying, but I'll walk beside you if that suits. It's slow going out to the ranch. I like slow going. I watched her decide whether to believe me. It's a specific thing to watch, a person deciding whether to trust that you're not going to hurt them in the ordinary way. It takes longer than a kind word. It takes a whole history to overturn. She came down the steps herself. One at a time, the crutch, the good leg, the wood, the good leg, her hand white on the rail, refusing my arm not out of pride exactly, but out of the long practice of not being able to depend on hands that might be snatched away. I stood close but not too close, and I did not reach for her, and I did not look away, and I think the not looking away was the thing. I'd learned it from her letters. She'd told me the men lifting her from the thrashing floor had looked away. So I didn't. I watched her come down 8 steps like it was the most ordinary arrival in the world, because to her it should have been, because it would have been for anyone else, and the least I could do was refuse to make it a spectacle. At the bottom she stood level with me at last, breathing hard, and up close she was older than her letters, and more tired than her letters, and more beautiful than anything I had any right to. And she looked me over the way I'd looked her over, weighing the real thing against the one she'd built in her head across a summer of writing. You're quieter than your letters, she said. You're braver than yours, I said, and yours were plenty brave. She laughed. It surprised us both. It came out of her cracked and rusty, like a thing not used in a while, and she put her free hand over her mouth as if to catch it and put it back. And I saw in that gesture a whole life of a woman taught that her joy took up too much room, and I decided, standing on that platform, that I would spend whatever I had left making room for it. I did not say that. I'm not a man who says things like that. I said, "Trunk's this way," and I went to fetch it, and I counted the paces to the baggage car, 19, and my hands were shaking, and I was happier than I had been in the whole long quiet of my life. We did not fall into anything easy. I'll tell you that now so you don't expect it. What we had at the depot was not love. It was recognition. 2 people who'd each been writing their worst fact at the bottom of the page, finally standing in front of each other with the page laid open. Love was work, and it came later, and it came hard. And some of it I did wrong. There was a whole winter ahead of us I haven't told you about yet, and a thing Nora did that spring that I will never fully understand and never stop being humbled by, and the day the leg failed her at the worst possible moment, and what she chose to do about it. But that morning all I knew was this. I hitched the wagon and I helped her up onto the seat. She let me, that once, her hand hard and cold in mine, and gone the second she was up and Marshall jumped into the bed, and we drove north out of Camino Verde toward the thin grass and the blue mountains, slow going, the way I like it. She was quiet a long time. Then she said, watching the country open up, "You didn't ask about the leg. In your first letter, everyone asks. You didn't ask." "Didn't seem like the interesting part of you," I said. She turned and looked at me, and I kept my eyes on the road because I didn't trust my face, and out of the corner of my eye I watched a tear go down her travel-gray cheek. One, just one, quick, and then her hand came up and wiped it hard like it had offended her. "No," she said finally, and something in her voice had set down a weight it had been carrying a very long way. "No, I don't suppose it is." I counted the fence posts along the road home. There were more than I remembered. The country was greener than it had been all spring. I didn't say any of the things a better man might have said. I just drove slow toward the Blue Mountains, and beside me a woman who had crossed a continent certain she was traveling toward one more disappointment sat up a little straighter with every mile, and behind us the dog slept, and I thought, write this down. All of it. A thing isn't real until you write it down, and I want this one to be real. So I have. Marriage, I have learned, is a thing you do twice. Once at the front of a church or, in our case, at the front of Judge Aldous Peck's parlor with Ruth crying into a handkerchief and her husband holding the youngest and Marshall shut outside whining at the door. And then again, quietly, 1,000 times after, every morning you choose the person a second time when the first choosing has worn thin. We were married in October. I did not write much in the ledger that month. A man doesn't count the days he's afraid to lose. The trouble is that recognition is not the same as knowing. At the depot, Nora and I had recognized each other, two people who'd written their worst fact at the bottom of the page. But recognizing a person's wound is not the same as living beside the whole difficult body of them, and by December I had learned the difference the hard way, which is the only way I ever learn anything. Here is a thing nobody tells you. When you send for a proud woman, you get all of her pride, not just the part that survived a thrashing floor. Nora had built herself, over 6 hard years, into a person who did not need. That building had kept her alive when needing would have killed her. But a marriage cannot be run by two people who have each sworn never to need, and I was as guilty as she was, a man who counted fence posts rather than say what he felt. So we spent that first winter like two cats tied at the tail, circling, wary, each waiting for the other to prove the old cruelty true. The winter came down out of the mountains early and mean. Snow to the windowsills, then above them. The kind of cold that makes the timbers of a house crack like gunshots in the night, so you wake reaching for a rifle that won't help you. We were snowed in 3 weeks in January with the nearest neighbor 4 miles off, and the town road gone entirely, just a white nothing where the world used to be. And in the close hot dark of a snowed-in house, I learned what Nora had not written in any letter. The leg pained her, not the wood, the flesh, the place below her knee where the limb ended, what she called dry as chalk, the part of me that isn't there anymore. She'd wake in the night with it burning, a leg that didn't exist screaming at her across 6 years, and there was nothing to rub, nothing to warm, nothing to do but wait it out with her jaw set and her fists in the quilt. The cold made it worse. Every joint of the wooden leg straps rubbed her raw in the dry frozen air, and she'd take it off at night and I'd see, in the lamplight, the chafed and calloused reality of what she carried, the skin worn to leather where the leather worked against it. The first night I saw it, I made the mistake of my life. I reached for the salve tin on the shelf, the one I used on the horse's galls, and I said, gentle as I knew how, "Let me." She went still all over. Then she took the tin out of my hand, not roughly, and set it down, and she said in a voice with no anger in it at all, which was worse than anger, "I have tended this leg alone for 6 years, Silas. I did not cross a continent to become a thing you nurse." I understood. I want to say I understood right away, but the truth is I sulked about it a week like a scolded boy, because I'd only wanted to help and it had been thrown back at me, and it took me that whole sulking week to see what she'd actually said. She hadn't said don't help me. She'd said don't make me small. There is a way of helping a person that tells them they are less, and I, meaning only love, had reached for the horse salve, the same tin I used on dumb animals, and asked to tend her like a gall. I count things. I should have counted the meaning of that tin before I picked it up. So I learned to help sideways. I couldn't tend the leg, she'd not have it, but I could keep the salve she chose warm by the stove so it went on soft instead of cold. I could build the bench by the fire lower, so she could sit and unstrap without bending her spine into the pain. I could say nothing, ask nothing, and simply leave a basin of warm water by her chair each night as if it had wandered there on its own, and pretend, when she used it, that I hadn't seen. Sideways. Love that doesn't announce itself as mercy. It was the hardest thing I ever learned, and I learned it that winter badly, a lesson at a time. She taught me things back, though she'd never have called it teaching. She could not walk the frozen yard to the barn. The crutch went through the crust, and the wooden leg found no purchase on ice, and it near killed her to be housebound, a woman who'd run a farm alone. So she took over the inside of our lives with a ferocity that startled me. She kept my ledger better than I ever had, in a clean, upright hand, and she found in 3 days of reading it every place I'd been cheating myself. The feed I overpaid for, the buyer down in Camino Verde who shorted me on weight every fall and had for years while I, too proud to seem distrustful, let him. She did the sums I'd been too lazy or too lonely to do, and she looked up from the ledger one evening and said, "Silas, this man has stolen a year's profit from you across 5 years. You have been robbed by a smiling man and paid him for the privilege." "He's always seemed friendly," I said. "Yes," she said, "that is how it's done." And she went back to the figures, and I understood that this was a woman who had learned, at great cost, that the friendliest face in the room is the one most worth watching, and I thought about the men who'd looked away while they lifted her, and I did not argue. Come spring, on her figures, I confronted the buyer and got a fair price for the first time in 5 years, and the extra was enough to matter. That was Nora. She could not cross the ice, so she found the theft in my books instead. She was never once in all our years a woman who did nothing. If you took a thing from her, a leg, a road, a season, she'd find some other place to put her strength, and she'd put it there twice as hard, out of something I can only call spite, the good kind, the kind that keeps the failed farm alive one more winter than it has any right to. I loved her by February. I want to mark the month because I know it exactly. It was not the recognition of the depot. It was the other thing, the built thing, the second marriage. It came on a night the wind was screaming and the fire was low, and she was in the rocker with a quilt over the place where her leg wasn't, reading aloud to me from a book of poems Ruth had lent us, in a voice I'd first known only as handwriting. She read badly, she stumbled on the long words, she'd had little schooling, and she got angry at herself for stumbling, and she pushed through anyway, stubborn, refusing to be beaten by a poem. And I sat there in the low firelight watching this furious, tired, magnificent woman wrestle a book of verse into submission, and I thought, with a calm that surprised me, "Oh, there it is. That's the whole of it, that's her. And I never came back from it. I'm still not back from it. I'm an old man writing this, and I have never once come back from that February." I didn't tell her. Of course I didn't. I counted the logs in the woodbox, 11, and I said, "You read fine," and she said, "I read like a child," and I said, "You read like a person who means it, which is rarer," and she stopped, and she looked at me over the top of the book for a long moment, and then she went on reading, and her voice was not quite so angry after that. Now I have to tell you about the choice, because it's the reason I set any of this down. It was March. The thaw came, and with the thaw the road opened, and with the road came the sickness. It moved through that high country every few years, a fever that took the children first, then the old, a scarlet burning thing the doctor in Camino Verde called by a Latin name that meant nothing and did nothing. It went through the Hollies' place 4 miles east and took 2 of their little ones in a week, and then it came to us, not to Nora and me, but to the family that mattered most to me in the world. Ruth's baby had come in February, a girl, and in the 3rd week of March a rider came up our thawing road half dead from the cold, Ruth's husband Amos, gray-faced, to say the fever was in his house. All 3 of the older children down with it, and the new baby, and Ruth herself burning up trying to nurse them, and no woman left standing in that house to do the nursing, and could Nora, because there was no one else, because the other women in town would not come into a fever house, and Ruth was asking for her. I said no before Nora could speak. I said it fast and hard, standing in the doorway with the cold coming in. Because I knew what a fever house was. I knew the nursing meant weeks in the sickness, breathing it, sleeping in it. And I knew I had learned in one winter exactly how the cold and the strain and the sleepless nights punished Nora's body, how the leg failed her when she was tired, how a well woman might survive a fever house, and a woman already spending half her strength just to stand might not. No, I said, Amos, I'm sorry, I'll come. I'll do what a man can, but not Nora. She's not the strain of it. Silas, Nora said. Just my name. That was all. I turned around and she was already up out of the rocker, already reaching for the crutch, and her face had a thing on it I'd not seen before, not in all the winter, a settledness, like a woman who has finished arguing with herself and found the answer waiting where she'd left it years ago. Those children are sick, she said, and Ruth is asking for me. Do you understand what that is? Do you understand what it is to be asked for, to be the one wanted in the fever house instead of the one left off the list? Her voice cracked and she let it crack. 6 years, Silas, I have been the woman men look away from. And your sister, who could have looked away from me at that wedding and did not, who cried real tears for a stranger. She is burning up in a house full of her sick bobbies, and she said my name. She asked for me. It could kill you, I said. My voice was not steady. The fever, the cold, the strain, Nora, you know what your body does when you're worn down. You could go into that house to nurse them and not come out. I can't, I've spent my whole life alone, and then you came and I can't, and there I stopped, because I'd nearly said the February thing, the built thing, and I'd never said it aloud, and I could not say it first in a doorway in a fight. She crossed the room to me. Crutch, good leg, wood, good leg. I knew the rhythm of it now like my own heartbeat, and she stood in front of me and she took my face in both her cold hands, which she had never done, and she said very quietly, so Amos couldn't hear, I know what my body does. I have kept careful accounts of exactly what my body does. I am the best bookkeeper of my own weakness in this territory. And I am telling you that a life spent protecting this body from every strain is not a life I crossed a continent to live. You did not send for a woman to keep safe on a shelf. You sent for a woman who manages. Let me manage this. Let me be, for once, the one who runs toward the burning house instead of the one everyone runs away from. I have thought about what I should have said. I have thought about it for 40 years. What I said was, I'm coming with you then, and she said, no, you'll bring the fever back to no one. There's no one here but us, and I'll not risk you either. And I said, then we go together and we come back together, or we don't. That's the whole of my offer, and it's not for negotiating. And she looked at me a long moment, and then she laughed, that cracked, rusty, startled laugh, and said, you've gotten stubborn. You weren't stubborn at the depot. I married a stubborn woman, I said. It's catching. We went to the fever house together. I won't set down all of what happened in those 3 weeks, partly because some of it is Ruth's to tell and not mine, and partly because there are things a man watches and does not write out of respect, so the watching stays clean. But I will set down this. Nora Ashby, who could not cross an icy yard, who woke in the night with a leg that wasn't there burning like coals, who spent half her waking strength on the plain cost of standing upright. Nora walked into a house full of scarlet fever, and she did not leave the sick for 18 days. She sat up the nights I couldn't. She cooled the children with cloths and sang to them in that cracked reading voice, and held Ruth's new baby against her chest through the worst nights, the little thing burning and crying, and she would not put it down, would not let anyone spell her, because, she said, a sick child should be held by someone who isn't afraid to hold them, and I have never once in my life been afraid of a thing that couldn't leave me. And I understood that too, finally, all of it. She took the leg off only to sleep, an hour here, 2 there, in a chair by the fire, and each time she strapped it back on I saw the flesh gone worse, rubbed to open sore by the constant strapping and unstrapping, and she said nothing and I said nothing, and I kept the salve warm by the stove sideways, and she used it sideways, and we did not speak of it. The children lived. All three of the older ones broke fever in the third week, weak as kittens but living. Ruth pulled through. Amos wept in the barn where he thought no one could see, and I let him think it. The baby did not live. I have to write that plainly because Nora would want it written plainly. The baby, the February girl, died on the 17th night in Nora's arms, and Nora held her long after, until the dawn came gray through the window, and she would not give her up, not to Ruth, who was too weak to rise, not to Amos, not to me. She held that child and she rocked her, back and forth, on a leg that wasn't there. And she made a sound I have never heard before or since, and hope to God I never hear again. A low sound with no words in it. The sound of a woman who has decided to carry someone else's grief so they don't have to carry it alone in their worst hour. She'd known. That's the thing I understood, sitting in the corner of that fever house watching. When she'd said in our doorway, "Let me be the one who runs toward the burning house," she had known there might not be a saving of everyone. She had walked in anyway. She had chosen to be present for the thing that could not be fixed, to hold what could not be kept, because someone had to and everyone else was too afraid. And Nora Ashby had run out of fear a long time ago on a thrashing floor and had nothing left to lose but her strength. And she decided to spend all of it, every last coin, on a family that had said her name. We came home in April, both of us. Worn to the bone, both of us, and the leg had done to her exactly what I'd feared. She was weeks recovering, laid up, the sores gone deep, a fever of her own that scared me white for 3 nights, but we came home together, the way I'd made her promise, and she lived. And I have never in my life been so angry at a person for being right, nor so undone by them. The night the road opened, before we left the fever house, Ruth, weak, hollow-eyed, having buried 1 child and kept 3, took Nora's hand in both of hers. And she said a thing I wrote down that very night in the corner of the room by a guttering candle, so I wouldn't lose it. And it's the only line of that whole terrible spring I did write, and I'll copy it here exactly. "I asked for you," Ruth said, "because I knew you wouldn't look away. I've watched everyone in my life look away from hard things. You're the only person I've ever met who runs at them. My brother is a lucky man and too dim to know the size of it." Nora said, "He knows some of it." And Ruth looked over at me in the corner with my candle and my pencil, and she said, "Does he? Has he told you?" And Nora looked at me too, both of them looking. And I understood I was being asked. In the ruins of that spring, in the wreckage of a buried child and a saved family, to finally say the February thing, the built thing, the thing I'd swallowed in a doorway a month before. I put down the pencil. Not well. I want that on the record, because if you've come this far you deserve the truth, and the truth is I said the biggest thing of my life like a man reading a feed bill. I stood up in the corner of that fever house with the candle guttering and Ruth watching and the dead child not yet a day buried, and I said, "In February, when you read me the poems and got angry at the long words, that was the night I knew I loved you. I've known since February. I counted the logs in the woodbox instead of telling you. There were 11. It was the worst-timed, worst-worded declaration a man ever made. Nora was gray with grief and exhaustion. Ruth had buried a baby that morning, and here I came with my 11 logs. But Nora looked at me across that ruined room, and something in her face, which had held so much that spring without breaking, finally broke. In the good way. The way a dam breaks and the valley floods and everything that was dry too long finally drinks. 11 logs, she said. Her voice had nothing left in it and she said it anyway. You knew in February and you told me the logs. I'm not good at the other, I said. No, she agreed. You're terrible at the other. And she started to cry finally for the baby and for herself, and for 6 years of being looked away from and for a plain stubborn man who'd waited 2 months and a funeral to say a true thing badly. And Ruth cried. And I stood there useless in my corner. And that is how love got said in my family, in a fever house over a candle, with the worst timing in the history of the territory. We went home. I told you that. We recovered, she slower than me. The fever house had cost her body dear, and it took the better part of that spring for the sores to close and her strength to bank back up. I did the outside work, and she did the inside, and we did not, either of us, say the February thing again for a long while, because some words you only need to say once if you then spend your years proving them. I proved them by learning to help sideways, permanent, as a way of living. She proved them by letting me, a little more each season, which for a woman like Nora was the harder labor of the two. Now the leg. I've been telling you all along there'd be a day the leg failed her at the worst possible moment. And here it is. And I've saved it for last because it's the day I understood who I'd actually married. All the way down, past the recognition and past the built love, to the bedrock of the woman. It was the autumn after the fever spring. The county fair down in Camino Verde, the one time all year the whole scattered country came together. The stock judging and the pie tables and the fiddlers and the whole valley crammed into the fairgrounds in their good clothes. Nora had not wanted to go. She'd not been to a public gathering that size since Ohio, since before the thrashing floor, and I understood without her saying it that a fairground was the worst possible place for a woman who'd spent 6 years learning where every set of eyes would land. But Ruth wanted her there, Ruth, who'd become fierce about Nora, who'd appointed herself Nora's champion the way she'd once appointed herself the authority on my failings. And between Ruth's insistence and Nora's own hidden hunger to be a person who went places, she agreed. She wore her good dress, the one she'd made herself over the winter, dark blue, and she'd worked at the hem so it fell right over the wooden leg, and she stood in front of the glass a long time that morning getting it exactly so, and I watched from the doorway and said nothing, because I understood the labor of it, the specific work of trying to walk into a crowded place looking, for once, like you might belong there ordinary. The fairground was crowded and rough, straw and mud and the crush of people, uneven ground, the worst footing in the world for a crutch and a peg. But she always managed through the morning, on my arm when she'd take it and on her own when she wouldn't, and I watched her almost start to enjoy it, watched her talk pie recipes with the church women, watched Ruth pull her from booth to booth like a prize, and I let myself hope she was having, for once, a plain good ordinary day. Then, in the afternoon, in the thickest part of the crowd, by the judging ring with half the county packed in close to watch the stock, the leg failed. The strap gave. The old worn leather she'd mended a dozen times in the heat and the crush and the uneven ground, it finally parted, and the wooden leg turned under her, and she went down. She went down hard, in her good blue dress, in the mud and the straw in front of half the valley. And the crowd did what crowds do, it turned. It turned all at once the way a field of cattle turns, and 100 faces swung around to look. And there it was, the exact thing she'd spent 6 years and a continent's worth of miles dreading, the thing she'd braced for at the depot, the moment she'd built her whole armored self to survive. Nora Ashby on the ground in the mud with her skirt fallen wrong and the wooden leg jutting out plain for everyone to see, and 100 strangers' faces arriving one by one at the understanding of what she was. I was 6 feet off, blocked by the crush, fighting to get to her. I couldn't reach her, and in the 2 or 3 seconds before I could, the longest second since the depot, and I have counted a great many seconds in my life, I watched my wife make a choice. She could have wept. God knows she'd have been owed it. She could have let me and Ruth haul her up and hurry her away covered and shamed, and no one would have blamed her, and it would have been the ordinary end to the ordinary nightmare. Instead, and I swear this on the ledger, on every true thing I've ever written down, instead, Nora Ashby sat up in the mud in front of half the county, and she looked around at all those staring faces, and she picked up the wooden leg that had come loose beside her, and she held it up in the air like a trophy, and in that cracked carrying voice she'd once used to read me poems, she said, loud, so the whole ring could hear, "Well, that's the second leg I've lost, and I got a good deal more warning this time." And she laughed. She laughed, sitting in the mud in her good blue dress, holding her own leg up in the air, and the sound of it, that rusty startled laugh I'd first heard on a train platform, carried out over the stunned crowd, and for one held breath the whole fairground didn't know what to do. And then an old rancher near the front, a hard old man named Deacons who'd buried 2 wives and never once been known to smile. Deacons barked out a laugh back at her, and then another man did, and then the whole ring of them was laughing. Not at her with her, the way you laugh when someone braver than you has just given you permission to stop being afraid of a thing. And Deacons pushed through and put out his leathery old hand, not to lift her. She wouldn't have that, but to shake hers, and he said, "Ma'am, that's the finest thing I've seen at this fair in 40 years, and I include the 2-headed calf of 71. And Nora shook his hand from the mud like a queen holding court, and I stopped fighting through the crowd because she did not need me. She had never needed me. She had turned the worst moment of her life into the moment the whole valley fell in love with her, and all I could do was stand at the edge of it and count. I couldn't help it. The number of faces that had gone from pity to something else. I lost count past 30. There were too many. Here is the ironic thing, the reversal, and I've turned it over 40 years and it still undoes me. She'd crossed a continent certain that the leg would end every chance at love. She'd written it at the bottom of her notice like a confession, like a wall. The advertiser is obliged to state that she has but one leg. She'd built her whole armored life around the certainty that the missing leg was the thing that would keep her forever on the outside, forever looked away from, forever the woman no one ran toward. And in the end it was the leg, the loss of it, held up in the air over a stunned crowd with a joke and a laugh. That did the opposite. It was her wound, worn open in public and answered with courage instead of shame, that made a whole valley take her in and never let her go. She became, after that fair, the most sought-after woman in the county, for the birthing rooms and the sick rooms and the fever houses. Yes, because everyone had heard she ran toward hard things, but also for the ordinary joys, the weddings and the quilting and the fair itself the next year, where they gave her a place of honor at the pie table she had not asked for and did not entirely want and secretly, I think, treasured to the end of her days. The thing she was sure would end every chance at love turned out to be the truest door into it, not because anyone pitied it, because she refused, at the one moment it counted most, to let anyone pity it. She held her own severed leg up in the mud and made a joke, and the whole world she'd been so afraid of leaned in the way Marshall had leaned in at the depot, the whole warm weight of it, toward a woman who would not be made small. We had our years. I'll not count them all out for you, a ledger's for the keeping, not the reading aloud, and some pages are only mine. There were good ones and hard ones. There was a drought that near broke us and a winter worse than the first. There were no children of our own. That was a grief we carried quiet, the 2 of us sideways, the way we carried everything. But there was Ruth's brood always underfoot, and the 3 that lived grew up half-raised in our kitchen, and the eldest girl, Ruth's eldest, followed Nora everywhere and learned to keep books in a clean, upright hand and learned, I think, the more important thing, which was how to run toward a burning house. Nora died in the winter, an old woman in her own bed, on a night the timbers cracked like gunshots the way they had that first Snowden year. It was her heart, quiet in her sleep, no fever house, no thrashing floor, no mud, the gentlest thing that ever happened to a woman who'd earned gentle. I was beside her. I'd like to tell you her last words were something for the ages, but the truth, the ledger truth, is that the last thing she said to me was the night before, ordinary, cross about the feed bill, that the man in Camino Verde was shorting us again and would I please, for once, watch the friendly ones. I did not tell her the February thing again at the end. I told her 1,000 times by then in 1,000 sideways ways, and she knew it down to the bone. And she'd stopped, years before, ever bracing to be a disappointment, which was the only monument I ever needed to whatever small good I did in her life. I'm an old man now. I keep the ledger still, out of habit, though there's less each year to count. Ruth's eldest runs most of the outfit. I mostly sit by the fire where Nora read me poems, and I get the accounts wrong on purpose sometimes just so the girl'll come set them right in that clean, upright hand that isn't Nora's and is. I kept the leg, the wooden one. It's on the shelf by the door where I once kept the things I meant to burn, and I have never burned it and I never will. Sometimes a visitor asks about it, and I tell them it belonged to the bravest person I ever knew, and they nod, thinking they understand and they don't, and that's all right. You can't hand a person a whole life across a fireside. You can only write it down and hope the true parts last longer than you do. She thought her missing leg would end every chance at love. I have kept careful accounts all my life of exactly what things cost and exactly what they're worth, and I will tell you the sum of it as plain as I know how. The leg was the price. The love was the country it bought. And a woman who'd been told 100 times she was half a person crossed a whole continent, sat down in the mud of a county fair, held the broken half of herself up over her head, and taught an entire valley, taught me, taught deacons, taught Ruth's watching children, taught anyone who'd ever flinched from a hard, true thing, how a whole person laughs. I've written it all down now, every true part I could bear to. There's one more thing I never told her, that I'll set down here at the last, in case the girl reads this after I'm gone and wants to know the one figure I never entered in any book.